chords. What is a chord? A chord is when you take multiple notes and you play them at the same time. In this case, I have a C major chord. You can take any arrangement of notes and you can play them at the same time, and you can technically have a chord, but it's going to take some steps to kind of understand what's going on there. So let's start with the most common type of chords, which is known as a triad. A triad is what you just saw there, was that C major chord, known as a C major triad. It's called a triad because it has a third, and then it has another third, and they're played together, or in other words, people often say that they're stacked on top of each other. If you look on the left side and you see the sheet music, you see the notes are stacked on top of each other, making that C major chord. So throughout this video, I'm going to go over stuff here on the left side on the piano, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing, but I made this picture over here on the right to help you out. So first of all, we have examples of triads, and in dark blue, we have the major, in red, we have the minor, in orange, we have the diminished, and in light blue, we have the augmented. Over here, we have different chords that all fit into the category that they're with. At the upper right-hand corner of this page, you see that I wrote the letters A through G twice, and I wrote 1 through 7. These numbers aren't relevant other than the fact that they're showing you the relationship between A and C is 1, 2, 3, and also from a B to a D would also be that 1, 2, 3, and it's just kind of showing you the numbers to make this a little more visual and easier for you if you're a beginner. This will probably help you wrap your head around this a little more. And then under that, here's a key. The key is showing you on the left-hand side here that these are all triads. So we have a 1, 3, and a 5. I'm going to explain what all this means, but we have a 1, 3, and a 5 on all these, so just know that they're all 1, 3, and 5s. They're triads, and with that, they have a different amount of semitones, which then makes them a different type of triad, which then has a different symbol. Okay, and I'm going to explain all this, but then over here at the upper left-hand corner of the same page, we have the chromatic scale, which I have 2 videos for you. Music Monday 5 goes over intervals. I'll put that in the description, and that will walk you through what intervals are, because we're going to be dealing with thirds here. So if you don't know what a third is, it would be good to check out that video, or just look up what a third is in music. And then the next thing would be my Music Monday number 4, which is important musical topics. In that, you'll find a section, I have it labeled through time, that I describe the chromatic scale, and I'm going to briefly explain what it is in this video. Okay, so the chromatic scale, as you can see, the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B all line up, top and bottom. But there's also notes like C sharp, which lines up with D flat. D sharp lines up with E flat. So just know, in simple terms, let's start with C to D. So C to D, we have those 2 notes, okay? So if I want to go up a sharpened version of C, there's this black note, which can be thought of as C sharp, because it's not D, but it's that black note in the middle of C and D. So a sharpened version of C would be C sharp, but also if I'm at D and I want a flattened version of D, there's that same note in the middle, which expresses a D flat. So this is known as an enharmonic, which in simple terms means that it has the same sound, but it looks different. So it's the same note, has the same sound, C sharp, D flat, same note, but what's happening is they're used in different contexts, so they're going to be called different things. So the chromatic scale over here is essentially going to be going up the same exact progression, and you can choose whether you want to look at it in the sharp, or you want to look at it in the flat, or if you want to look at both, they're right above and below each other, and they line up. So every time you see, let's see a F sharp, that's the same thing as a G flat, like an A flat, same thing as a B flat, same sound. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss some things to help us understand why we have the major, minor, diminished, and augmented, and how we can wrap our head around what all these actually mean. So we'll start with a major triad, C, E, and G. So a major triad means that we have a major third and a minor third, and we put those on top of each other. Okay, and that's a major triad. So I'm going to go over this pretty slowly and pretty simply in the beginning, and just know if it's going a little too slow, it'll pick up a little more later on. I'm just going to try to explain this as simple as I can for anyone who is very new to this. So first off, we have two thirds. So we have a C to E, which is a third, and an E to a G, which is a third. So to build a third, we're going to think about just looking at the natural notes. The natural notes are these: A through G, no sharp, no flat. So you can kind of use this key to help you as I go over this on the piano. So if I want a third, I'm going to start with C, then I'm going to call that C my 1, then I'm going to go up D, which is my 2, and then E, which is my 3. So if I just take my 1 and my 3, now I have a third, okay, because I have C to E. Then if I go from E, I go up another third, F, G. So now I have E to G, which is another third. The reason why it's a 1, 3, 5 is because from this first note, this is a third, and from this first note, this other one is a 5. Okay, so to really understand what's going on here with the minor and major is that we look at the semitones. So if we're looking at the semitones, we're going to go up every possible note that we have, which is known as the chromatic scale. So piano is going to contain all the notes that we can play here on music, and we're going to take advantage of that by counting up the chromatic scale on the piano to help us understand this. So I'm going to start on the note C, and if I go from C to E, this is how I'm going to count it. I'm going to count my first note as my 0, so I'm not going to count that as a 1. I'm going to count the next possible note that comes after that as my 1, and then every other possible note that comes after that is then going to follow. So 2, 3, 4, until we land on the note that we want. We want the E. So we went from C, 1, 2, 3, 4. We landed on E, which is where we stop. So that means 4 semitones, and that means a major third. Then if we go from E and we want to go up to that next note, that G, we see that's a minor third, so let's count what those semitones are. We start on E, 1, 2, 3. So 3 semitones makes a minor third, while 4 semitones makes a major third. So in two different ways of explaining this, if we get a major third and we stack a minor third on top of that, we get a major triad. Or if we get 4 semitones and we put 3 semitones on top of that, then we have our major triad. Just two different ways of looking at it, which both are very helpful to understand what's going on here. Next, just one more in major. I'm going to do a G, a B, and a D. So how I got there is I went from my G, I went up that third again, G, A, B, that's a third. Then from B, which is my 1, 2, 3, to D, which is my other third. So now I have a major third from G to B, and then a minor third from B to D. So to count those semitones one more time, when you're counting semitones again, you don't start on that first note that you're starting from. So we're starting from G, we're going to start counting semitones on the next possible note. 1, 2, 3, 4, B, 1, 2, 3, to D. Okay, so now we have a minor triad. Try to guess what this is before I tell you the answer. So a minor triad is a minor third with a major third on top. So same thing, we get two different thirds. We get a D, we go up to the third, F, we go from F, we go up a third, we land on A, and the semitones are what makes it minor. The semitones in between these notes. So let's start on D, 1, 2, 3, lands us on F. 1, 2, 3, 4 from F lands us on A. Since we have those 3 semitones, minor third, and then 4 semitones, major third, that is what makes a minor triad. So in any case, any notes that you have, if there's a minor third on the bottom and a major third on the top, you have a minor triad. So just one more in E minor triad. Go from E, go up that third, we go to G, we go up that third, we land on B. We count the semitones in the middle. We have 1, 2, 3 from E to G, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 from G to B. And as you can see here, they're symbolizing the minor with M-I-N. So there is a symbol when it's minor. And as you can see on the right-hand section where my key is, I put a lowercase m, which also symbolizes the fact that it's minor. So when it's minor, it will be labeled. But as you may have noticed, and as you can see here, when it was major, it didn't say major. It just said C. So when it's not labeled, it automatically means that it's major, but major can also be labeled. It can be labeled with M-A-J, but just know that it can be labeled, but if it's not, that means it is major. Okay, next I have a diminished triad. Okay, so a diminished triad is interesting because I have a minor third and then another minor third on top of that. So it's just two minor thirds, and that makes a diminished triad. So quickly to count those semitones, 1, 2, 3 from B to D, 1, 2, 3 from D to F. So 3 semitones and 3 semitones. But as you can see, the semitones are what make it diminished. It's still 2/3 away from each other. So I still have a B, I built a third, D, I built another third, F. So it's still 2/3 stacked on top of each other. The only difference is those semitones in the middle of the notes. So as you can see here above the piano, they're labeling a B diminished as B-D-I-M, which D-I-M is an abbreviation for the word diminished. And on the right hand side with my key, you can see that I labeled diminished as a little like degree symbol. So you have like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That degree symbol after the note is also a very common way to symbolize that this is a diminished chord. Next is augmented. So here's a C augmented chord. So all that this means is that we have a major third and another major third on top of that. Played together, augmented. As you can see, they label augmented as an AUG, which is an abbreviation for the word augmented. And on the right hand side where my key is, I put a plus sign, which is also a very common way of symbolizing that this is an augmented chord. So now that I went over the simple ones, I'm going to quickly go over some of these ones with more flats and sharps, just to kind of show you how simple it is. And nothing's really too difficult here. It's all the same thing, just using different notes is just the best way to look at it. So let's start with a D major triad, which is D, F sharp, and A. So F sharp, that may look a little intimidating with the sharp in there, but just know it's the same thing of a major third and a minor third stacked on top of each other, which is another way of just saying from that first note we have that 1, 2, 3, 4 semitone difference, and then from that next note we have that 1, 2, 3 semitone difference. So now we're going to have E flat, G, and B flat, which is going to make an E flat major triad, but it's just the same thing, just using some different notes here. We're going to have a 1, 2, 3, 4 from the first note to the second note, and then from the second note to the third note, a 1, 2, 3. Same thing when we do minor. I could do a C, E flat, and a G, and all that means is that from that first note to that second note, 1, 2, 3 semitones. From that second note to that third note, 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones. And now we have a minor triad. Okay, I think you get the point, but I'm just going to go over one for diminished and one for augmented in the same sort of style. Is that I have an E, a G, and a B flat. And all this means is that because it's diminished from that first note to that second note, 1, 2, 3 semitones. From that second note to that third note, 1, 2, 3 semitones. Okay, so then if I want to do an augmented triad, and I have the note D, F sharp, and A sharp, it's calling the A sharp a B flat, but those are the same thing. And if you look at my key there, it'll show that to you. So again, all this means is that from the first note to the second note, 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones. From the second note to the third note, 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones. Okay, so that was a little more like review, so let's actually dive into this a little further, and that is if we take a major chord, a C, E, and a G, that's major because we have a major triad on the top and a minor triad on the bottom. So if we take this middle note here, and we lower the middle note by 1 semitone to the left, if we're already in major, if we think about it, now this note to this note is going to be 3 semitones away, because we just lowered it by 1 semitone. So now from here to here is 3, but if you think about it, if here to here was already 3 semitones, E to G, now if I turn E to E flat and I move this over to the left one, now that's a bigger gap by 1, making this 4 semitones apart. Let's count it again. So from C, 1, 2, 3. Then if I count from that E flat, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm on G. So as you can see now it's a minor third with a major third on top, making it a minor triad from a major triad, just shifting that middle note to the left one or down 1 semitone. So next vice versa, which is probably pretty obvious, but if now we're from minor and we want to make it major, since we have a minor here and then we have a major here, if we take this middle note and we shift it one to the right, like the opposite of what we just did, okay, so let's look at it in context. C, E flat, G, we take it one to the right. Now we have a major third and a minor third. And now if we want to turn a minor into a diminished, so all we do is we take a minor triad and we think about what this means. It means we have a minor third, 3 semitones, and we have a major third, 4 semitones. So if we want to make this 3 semitones and 3 semitones, we could just take that last note and we could lower it by a semitone. So now we have D, F, and A flat. So now it's a D diminished triad. And that's because we have that minor third with that other minor third on top, because we changed that major third from a major third to a minor third. Next, if we have a major triad and we want to change it into an augmented triad, we just have to take that last note and raise it by a half step. So now we have what they're calling an A flat, but it's the same thing as G sharp. So we have a C, E, and G sharp, which means that we have a major third here, and we have a major third here, stacked on top of each other, C augmented. So I'm going to have a different video dedicated to this topic, but I kind of just want to briefly go over the fact that normally triads are built from a scale. So if you have a C major scale, which is another way of saying we have these white notes here that we're playing, those are the notes that make up a C major scale. And if we want to build a triad using those notes, we can just start building triads with those notes that we have. So let's look at how we do that. So we start in the note C, we just go up a third, we go up a third again, and now using the notes that are in C major, we just made a C major triad. So it's probably pretty obvious that C major is in the key of C major, but let's go over one more. If we have D, we go up a third, and we go up another third. Now we have a D minor triad, which is also in the key of C major, because it's built off the notes that make up C major. If that interests you, just stay tuned, and I'm going to have a video about that coming out very soon. If there's anything else that I'd like to add, it's probably the fact that a lot of people are going to call a fifth, like in this case, a C to a G is a fifth, a 5 chord. But it's really good to know that you're not really going to find other circumstances where you're going to play 2 notes and it's going to be thought of as a chord. So let's say major second, let's say major third, you know, and so on. But basically, you're not typically going to be thinking about that as a chord or that as a chord. Typically, when you're thinking about a chord, you're going to be thinking about 3 or more notes. And the most common ones are what I showed you in this video are the triads. But at the same time, 2 notes being played together are what are called dyads. D-Y-A-D. And what this means is that these are 2 notes being played together that can hint at or be a part of a chord. So like if I had a C and an E, well that's basically half of a C major chord right there. Okay, so that could be hinting at a C major chord if you just heard C and E. Just like if you heard that C, G, that 5, that could be hinting at a C major chord even though you don't have that E in there. And this basically goes with any note, so this is a little more complex, but let's say you had a C and a D, and you think, well that's just a major second, how does that relate to a chord? Well, it relates to a chord when you start stacking intervals that are upper extensions, which is going to be saved for another video. But if we go C, E, G, B, and we land on D, as you can see, I have a major 9 chord, because I stacked thirds until I got to that D note, which is my 9th. But if I remove every note besides C and D, as you can see, it's calling it a major second here, which I kind of agree with because you're just hearing the major second. But what I'm explaining is that a major second, especially in certain contexts, can be thought of as a dyad, sounding the notes that are found in a D major 9 chord, but you're just hearing the C and the D, which can be thought of as the 1 and the 9. Okay, so chord inversions. Okay, so now what happens if I take this C major chord, and I want to use these same notes, I still don't have a C major chord, but I want to rearrange some of the notes in a different order. Well, welcome to chord inversions. So when you have a triad, you can have 2 different inversions. So first you start off in root position, which is what you normally have. You have a 1, 3, and a 5. So there's our root position. You can have a first inversion, and you can also have a second inversion. Now before we get into this and start to understand these more, let's understand one really important topic, and that is that when we're inverting chords, we're not changing anything to do with major or minor. So here we have a C major chord. So if I go to my first inversion, that's still a C major chord in first inversion. If I go to my second inversion, it's a C major chord in second inversion. So it maintains that major throughout it. It's still major, it still uses the same notes. We're just rearranging the notes. And we are rearranging them in a specific way. So let's get into it. So as I was saying, in root position, you have a 1, you have a 3, and a 5. And just to quickly describe that one more time in case they didn't quick, that's because you have a root note, your 1, you go up to your 3, so this is your 1, 2, 3. And then you go up to your 5, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's why you have a 1, you have a 3, and then you have a 5. So since we take that root note C and we build a third above that to E, and then we take that E and we build a third above that to G, we have 2 thirds. So as you can see in this picture, I showed that between C and E, you have a third, and then between E and G, you have a third. When it's all stacked together, you have a 1, 3, and a 5. Over here in this box is what's called figured bass, and in root position, figured bass, you don't mark it. So figured bass is a whole nother video on its own, but I'm still going to show you how to identify and how to label for figured bass in first and second inversion towards the end of this video. Okay, so that was our root position. Now let's go to our first inversion. So since we are using these 3 notes, C, E, and G, what you do is you take this first note, your C, and you now put it on top of the E and the G. So let's see that one more time. I took my C, which was the root before it started C, E, G. I'm taking that C, and now I'm putting it above the E and the G. And since these notes repeat, it's an easy way to think about it. If you can read your piano, you just remove the first C, and you go to your next C. So our first inversion, if you can see, it's already a little weird because as you can see, there's kind of a bigger gap in between G and C here. That's not a third, that's a 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a fourth. Okay, so between E and G, you still have that third because as you can see, it's basically like the second half of the chord we still have right here. We still have the E and the G. But now if we go from G to C, and even if you count G, A, B, C, that's 4 away, so G and C creates that fourth. In other words, instead of having a 1, 3, and 5, when we do a first inversion of a triad, now we have a 1, 3, and a 6. 1, 3, and 6. Because from that first note, you have a 1, 2, 3, and then from that first note, you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. An easy way to comprehend that is that normally you have a 1, 3, and a 5, which is consisted of a third and another third. And now because we have a third and a fourth, you just think that it's a 1, 3, and a 6 because it's one bigger. And as you can see down here, it shows you basically the notes that you're playing, your 1, 3, and your 5, and then the notes in between that. So you have your C, D, E, F, and G. It helps when you say the chord notes loud and when you say the non-chord notes not as loud. Same thing with first and second inversion. Okay, so now let's refresh what we just did. So we just took a root position triad, and we just took this top note, and now we moved it on top of the chord. So now it is the highest note in the chord. So now if we want to do a second inversion, we're going to again take this beginning note, and we're going to put it on top of the chord. So as you can see, I just took that E from the beginning, now I placed it in the end, so it's on top of the chord. So as you can see with my second inversion triad, now I have a bigger gap in between my G and my C. And if you count, I have a 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I have a fourth there. And then from my C to my E, I have a third. So now instead of having a 1, 3, and a 5, I have a 1, 4, and 6. And remember, it's not a 1, 4, and 5, because I mean, you can see that on the piano right there. But if you think about it, I started from my 1, I went up to a fourth, and then I went up another third. In other words, from that note, I'm going up 2 more notes. So when compared to that root note, my G, you can see I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 away from my G. And that's why I have a 1, 4, and a 6. Okay, so to conclude, if we have a C major triad, we have the notes C, E, and G. And that would be root position. And now if I want to do a first inversion, all I do is I take this first note, which is that C, and I put it on the end. So now I have an E, G, and C. Now back to root position. If I'm in root position and now I want a second inversion, all I'm going to do is take these first 2 notes and I'm going to place both of those on the end or on top of the G. Okay, here's a cool way to visualize this. I have my C, E, and my G written on 3 different cards. So putting together, here's my C major triad in root position. And if I want to take this C major triad in root position and I want to turn it into a first inversion triad, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bottom note, in this case is a C, and I'm going to put it on top of the chord. So now I have an E, G, and C chord, making a first inversion C major triad. Then if I go back to the root position, now if I want a second inversion from here, from the root position state, all I do is I take the bottom 2 notes, in this case are C and E, I keep them in the same order, so C and E is in the same order still, and I have a G, C, and E. Pay attention, it's in the same order, so in the beginning I had C, E, G, and now I have G, C, E. That is second inversion. Okay, so now figured bass. This is going to be just a brief kind of intro to it. So as I was discussing, when you have your first inversion, you don't have a 1, 3, and a 5. You now have a 1, 3, and a 6. So to notate that in figured bass, because the difference between your root position and your first inversion is that 6th, you're going to notate in figured bass a 6. Okay, so now let's look over here. As you can see, I have that treble clef, so that's telling us we have our C note right here. So if you have a 6 below that, that is your figured bass telling you to play your first inversion. So 6 is telling you instead of playing a 1, 3, and 5, you're playing a 1, 3, and 6. Another way to look at that could be like your 6 is telling you not to play your 5 in a chord. So now if I read that I see the C note and I see a 6 below that, I'd be playing this. So as you can see, although my C is the notated note, it actually ends up being the last note. But that makes sense because the 6 is telling me to play a first inversion. So if you think about a first inversion C chord, you're just going to think E, G, and C. So then in terms of figured bass, if this had nothing written below that, that would just be telling you to play a root position. So now if you have a 4-6, that's going to be telling you to play your second inversion. So your G, C, and E. You read it 4-6 because you read it like a chord. So chords are going to be read up. So you're going to have your G, C, E chord. So you're going to have your 4 and your 6. You're going to have a root, a 4, and then a 6. And as you can see, that's what we have here. So as you can see again, my C is my notated note, but that's telling me to play second inversion. So what that's really telling me to play is G, C, E. That's it for this video. My next video is going to be chord inversions for 7th chords. And things start to get really interesting because when you have those 4 different notes, now you already have one more option with that. So now you have a third inversion option. But also something interesting happens when you start inverting 7th chords. Understanding chords that are in a key. This is a very important topic because when you understand this, you understand when you're playing in a certain key, what chords to play with that. So if you're playing in the key of G, then you'll know what notes to play for that key of G. And the major scale is a really good place to start off because you can figure out a lot of other things just based off first the major scale as kind of like a foundation. So we're going to start off on the major scale, and as always, just to make it easy, we're going to start in the key of C. So as you can see, I have the notes written out. I have the C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and above them they're labeled 1 through 7, just showing you that it starts on C and then the 7th one is B, and then again if we're at B and then we went up to that 8th one, we go up to the octave, which would again be the 1. If you want to see a video about the major scale, I'll leave that in the description, as well as a video all about these Roman numerals that you see on top of these notes, but I will explain what these are in this video as well. Alright, so as you can see, I have some stuff written out. First of all, it's when you build triads in a key, you use the notes that are in the key to build it, so it's pretty simple. So I have a video about triads that'll also be down below, so I'm just going to go over this kind of briefly. So as I taught in my chord video, to build a triad, you just start from a bass note, and then you go up a third, and then you go up a third again. All that you do is you take the 7 notes in the key that you're using, and yes, saying a major scale is the same thing as saying this is the key of C major, so that's kind of how you'd word it. You'd say the key of C major, or you'd say a C major scale. And since you have these 7 notes to work with, and they repeat, these are the notes you're going to build your chord from. So starting on C, if we build a triad, we go from C, we go to E, and then we go to G. C, E, and G is a major triad, so that's why if you see above where it says C, there's a capital I Roman numeral. So that capital I Roman numeral is telling you it's the 1. It is the first note in the scale, and because of that, it's known as the tonal center. So it's where the tone of the music is sort of centering around. then the capital I just tells you that is a 1 and the 1 is major. So an easy way to know if a chord is major or minor is to look at where B or E is in the chord. So as we see here, we have an E in the middle of the chord. And if we think about it, we're going up C, D, E. So in that first little bit, because this is our first triad, because we have C, D, then E, it's understood that C has C sharp and D has D sharp. So if we think about that, that has 4 semitones. And the reason is because if you look at E to G, if you look at its E, F, G, and if you think about it, there is no E sharp. So you're missing a semitone already. And then F does have an F sharp, and then it goes to G. So the only difference there compared to my C, D, E before this is that the E is missing a sharp here. So since we know that there's a missing sharp here, we automatically know that this is a minor triad, the E, F, G. So you see C, E, G, and you see that E in the middle, and you can automatically know that this is a major because you know that the minor third is on the second half. Okay, so now we just did a C chord, and we had C major. So now moving on to D. Okay, so if we build a triad from D, then we have the note D, we go up to F, and then we go up to A. So this is a D minor triad. And as you can see above the D note, it says that there's the 2, and then it is the I, which in Roman numerals means 2, and then it's lowercase, telling you that it's minor. So we could quickly use the same method as before to think about why this is minor. So we could think about this first third, and we think that it's D, E, F, A. So since there's that E in the middle there, then that means that it's missing a sharp from D to F. So that first third is a minor. Then if you think about it, the second third is just F, G, A. So there's no B or E anywhere in there. So you know that there's no missing sharp. So you know that's major at the end. So this is a minor chord. Okay, and we just keep doing the same thing. So now we start on E. We go E, G, B, which again gives us another minor. From there we go up to the 4, which in C major would be an F, and we go F, A, and then C. So as you can see, since it repeats, we still go back to C. We're still building a third. So you can imagine where if this keeps going, that after this B, we're going to go right back again to our C. And this is an F major chord. And as you can see, there's that capital IV above the F. Next, G, B, and then D, giving you a G major chord. A, C, and E, I like to just think about ace. And this is a minor chord. And next, if we start on the 7th note in the scale, B, we have the notes B, D, and F, which this one is different from all the other. This is not major and this is not minor. So if you think about it, if we started on B, then we already have that missing sharp in the beginning. So B, C, D, so there's only that one missing sharp from that B. And then from D, it goes D, E, F. So again, there's a missing sharp in this second third. So both of these thirds are a minor third. And because of that, this is a diminished chord. So to sum it up in a way that I kind of just remember it, because there's only 7 here, so there's not that many to remember, is that your 1, 4, and your 5 are major. Your 2, 3, and your 6 are minor. And your 7 is diminished. So if you've ever heard people saying, like a lot of times a guitar song would be a 1, 4, 5. So that would mean the song would play a 1 chord, and then it would play a 4 chord, and then it would play a 5 chord. And then after the 5 chord, then it will resolve back onto the 1 chord. So it'll go 5, and then it'll go 1. So that would be known as a chord progression. So it's really good to know this, because from here you can start understanding what chord progressions are, and you can even start building your own chord progressions. 7 chords. What is a 7 chord? So now if we want to turn this triad chord into a 7 chord, all that we do is we add one more third on top of it. Okay, so let's do a quick review of what a triad is and then build a 7 on top of that. So right here on the right hand side in this yellow where it says 7th, I have basically a little key here for you to look at while I'm showing you on my piano. So I'm going to have A as my first note. It's going to be my 1. And as you can see, the yellow notes are going to be highlighted. Those are the ones in the chord. The notes that are not highlighted, those are not in the chord. They're in the middle of the chord, just to kind of show you what's going on here. So if I start on that A and I want to build a third, I'm going to go up from that 1, which is my A, 2, 3. I'm going to create a third on my C. From my third, if I go up another third, and I would consider this basically my 1 then. So if this is my 1, I'd go up 1, 2, 3, and now I have my other third, and then from this note I do the same thing, so 1, 2, 3, and of course we're not playing those notes that are in the middle, we're just playing the thirds, and this gives us a 7 chord. Okay, so this is where things get interesting. We can have a major triad, we can have a minor triad, we can also have a diminished triad, we can even have a augmented triad, and this is the interesting part. So now if we have an A and we want to build a 7th from that, we could build a major 7th, we could also build a minor 7th. And since a diminished means that it is one semitone from the state of being minor, if we have a diminished 7th, we'd take that minor 7th, we'd go down one semitone, now we have a diminished 7th, more commonly known as a major 6th. As you see above the piano, it's calling it a major 6th, because in most cases you would consider this a major 6th, but sometimes harmonically you would consider this a diminished 7th. So now if we go back to our minor, we go up to that major, if we go up one semitone from our major, now we have an augmented 7th. But that is more commonly known as an octave. But sometimes in harmony, you'd be thinking about this as an augmented 7th. Okay, so now if we take our triads that are in the form of major, minor, diminished, and augmented, we can see if we start adding 7ths on top of this like I just went over, we could add a major 7th to any of these, we could add a minor 7th to any of these, we could also add that diminished 7th to any of these, and we could also have that augmented 7th from any of these. So being able to do that gives us a lot of combinations. Okay, so those 5 most common types of 7 chords are here. I'm going to explain what's going on. And if you look over on the right hand side, I have it kind of all spelled out for you. I have the fact that we have our 1, 3, 5, and 7 for all 5 of these. And then to the right, it describes the semitones that then differentiate each type that it is, which then tells you what symbol you're going to use to express what 7th chord you are using. Okay, so here are all the possible 7th chords. If we take all those major, minor, diminished, and augmented triads, each one of them, and then we separately add a major, minor, diminished, and augmented 7th on each one of these different ones, we get all these different combinations. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the simpler photo in a second, which only has the 5, but I'm just going to kind of show you how this works right now, how to read this chart that I made. So as you can see with my triads and with my 7ths, my dark blue is major, my red is my minor, my orange is diminished, and light blue is augmented. So basically how I labeled this, it makes sense. So let's look at the first one. So if we have a major 7th, we're going to have a major triad on the bottom with a major 7th on the top. And that blue is telling you that. Then if we go over one, this is called a dominant 7th, it tells you right here. And because we have a blue on the bottom and a red on the top, that's telling you a dominant 7th has a major triad on the bottom with a minor 7th on the top. And so on, we go to major diminished. This is telling us we have a major triad with a diminished 7th on top. And we have major augmented, we have a major blue on the bottom, light blue, we have that augmented on the top. So that works for all these. Let's look at a random one. We'll go to this third one in augmented. It's called the augmented diminished because we have an augmented triad on the bottom and we have a diminished 7th on top of that. Okay, so now back to the simpler photo of just the 5 most common types of 7 chords. These are the most common types of 7 chords because this is what happens when you take a major scale and you start to build 7 chords, giving you the notes that are in the key. You get these 5 different variations of 7 chords. You get a major 7th, you get a dominant 7th, you get a minor 7th, you get a half diminished 7th, and you have a diminished 7th. So let's go over each one of these, how you read it first, so you won't have confusion as I'm going over this. And then I'm going to show you on the piano so we can make more sense of this. And remember, there's that key here on the right, which is going to show you the semitones that you're able to use, which tells you the type and the symbol, but probably the most important is it's going to show you these semitones. So to read this, our 1 and our 3 has 4 semitones in between it. The 3 and the 5 has 3 semitones in between it. And since there's a 4 on the bottom and a 3 on top, that means a major triad. So major triad is here. And then since the 7th is just added on top of that, we see from our 5 to our 7 is a major 7th with those 4 semitones giving us a major 7th. That's all going to be explained throughout this video, but I just kind of want to show you how to read this key. Okay, so let's go here. Let's look at major 7 again. So again, there's blue on the bottom, blue on the top. So major 7th means that we have a major triad and we have a major 7th and we put them together and now we have that major 7. While if we go over one, you can see the dominant 7 has a major triad on the bottom, but then it has a minor 7th on top of that. When combined, we have a dominant 7th. As you can see above the piano, they're just calling this a G7, while in the other one before this, they were calling it a major 7. So as you can see, when it's a dominant 7, it's not labeled. So if you just have a chord that is a A7, B7, A flat 7, whatever it is, if it just has a note and then a 7, you know that it's going to be your dominant, which means you have your major triad and then your minor 7th on top of that. And again, over here on the right, I have the symbols laid out for you so you can have a reminder. Alright, so from that dominant 7, if we go down 1 and we go to this minor 7th, we can see that a minor 7 has a minor triad and then a minor 7th on top of that. Okay, so if you go down 1, you have a half diminished 7, which is showing you that you have a diminished triad and then you have a minor 7th on top of that. So now if this kind of boggles your mind a little bit and you're kind of confused about this one, don't worry because this will be explained. I'm just kind of going over it right now, then I'm actually going to explain it in depth after this. Okay, so as you can see here, they're calling it a B minor 7 flat 5. And that is also a very common explanation of what's going on here. You can commonly see that a chord would be called a minor 7 flat 5, and that is the same thing as a half diminished. Okay, so over here in that key, you can see that my half diminished is labeled with a degree symbol with a slash through it. And that is also a very common way of expressing that this is a half diminished, because a diminished is a degree symbol. So we call it half diminished, we just put that slash through it. Okay, so if we go over 1 from there, we have a diminished 7, which can also be known as a fully diminished 7, since our last one was a half diminished 7. So for a fully diminished 7, as you can see, we have the orange on the bottom, orange on the top, which means we have that diminished triad on the bottom, and then we have a diminished 7th on top of that. And as I explained in the beginning, a diminished 7 is the same thing as a major 6th in context. So as you can see, when I actually put these together and I add that diminished 7th on the top of it, over here on the piano, above the piano, it actually, the app is recognizing this as a B diminished 7. And this is probably because it's recognizing the semitone difference between each interval. So let's kind of go over that now. So the more complicated, juicier ones are going to be left towards the end. This might be a little simple, might be kind of like reviewing the beginning, but this is really good to fully understand and grasp this. So because that major 7th was a major triad with a major 7th on top of that, so since a major triad is a major 3rd with a minor 3rd on top of that, and then from there, since we just add that major triad on top of that, all it's telling us is that when we have a C major 7, what's going on is between the first note and the 3rd, we have 4 semitones. Between that 3rd note and the 5th note, we have 3 semitones, making it major. And then from that 5th note, we go up to that 7th note, our 4 semitones from that 5th note. So again, that's just telling us we have 4 semitones here, 3 semitones here, 4 semitones here, and when you put them all together, you create a major 7. Okay, so next, dominant 7th. So the dominant 7th was just telling us that we have a major triad on the bottom, we have that minor 7th on top. So in other words, that's telling us that from our first note to our 3rd, we have 4 semitones. From that 3rd to the 5th, we have 3 semitones. And then from that 5th to our 7th, we have another 3 semitones. So it is a pattern of 4, 3, and 3. That creates your dominant 7th chord. So with this, you could be on any note on the piano. Okay, so now I'm going to show you one with a bunch of flats just to kind of show you it doesn't matter if you have flats, sharps, or what notes you're using. It just matters about these semitones. Okay, so if I take an E flat and I go up 4 semitones, I'm going to go to a G. If I go up 3 semitones, that's going to give me a B flat. And if I go up another 3 semitones, it's going to give me a G flat. And that's going to give me an E flat dominant 7th chord. And again, it's labeled just as E flat 7. There's nothing telling us major, minor, or anything. So that's how we know when it's a 7th chord and it's not labeled with anything. It's a dominant 7th chord. Okay, next, the minor 7th. Since a minor 7th is just that minor triad with a minor 7th on top of that. Okay, so that's just telling us from our 1 to our 3, we have 3 semitones. Then from our 3 to our 5, we have 4 semitones, making it that minor triad. Then from that 5 to the 7, we have another 3 semitones, making this whole chord a minor 7th chord. So in other words, it's a pattern of 3 semitones, 4 semitones, and then 3 semitones again. And for any of these, major, minor, diminished, or augmented, it's the same thing. You can use any notes in combination. It's just the semitones that make it the quality that it is. So now let's go down one to our half diminished 7, or in other words, our minor 7 flat 5. And before I tell you the answer, can you guess why it's called a minor 7 flat 5? Well, I'm going to give you the answer right now. Okay, so let's first talk about the semitones here. So of course, if you have your half diminished 7, you're going to have a diminished triad, and then you're going to have a minor 7th on top of that. Okay, so let's look at these semitones. So we're going to start on B. So from our 1 to our 3, we're going to have 3 semitones, a minor 3rd. And then from our 3 to our 5, we're going to have another 3 semitones, another minor 3rd. So there's our diminished triad. Okay, so let's first think about the flat 5. So in context of a 7, a lot of times you'd be calling a half diminished 7 chord a minor 7 flat 5. Well, let's look at why. If we took this diminished chord and we added 1 semitone to the 5th, in other words, sharpening the 5th, now we have a minor triad. And from that minor triad, if we added that minor 3rd on top of it, or in other words, a minor 7th from that first note, then as you can see, we have a B minor 7. But let's look at what happens when we take this minor 7th chord and we lower the 5th, or we flatten the 5th. Okay, so we have a minor 7th, and now we have a minor 7th flat 5. So all that it's describing is that a lot of times people think of this as it sounds to them like a minor 7th with a flat 5 in it, instead of thinking about it as a half diminished. Different people will call this different things, so it's probably good to know both. Okay, so let's go over semitones here to really figure out what's going on here. So from that 1 to our 3, we have 3 semitones. From that 3 to our 5, we have another 3 semitones. And then from the 5 to the 7, there's 4 semitones, which makes it the half diminished. And this is kind of where the red flags go off in my head of confusion, because I'm thinking, wait, I just built a minor 3rd, I did another minor 3rd, okay, I have my diminished triad, and then I put a major 3rd on top of that, you see? So it's a major 3rd compared to the 5, but we've got to realize that a diminished triad is kind of a weird thing. Because normally when you have a major triad, or if you have a minor triad, you're going to have a variation of 4 semitones on the bottom, 3 semitones on the top, or vice versa. While with diminished, you just have 3 semitones and 3 semitones. So if you add all that up, you have 3 plus 3. So you have 6 semitones. While in a major, since you have 4 then 3, you have 7 semitones. And in a minor, since you have 3 and 4, you again have 7 semitones. Okay, so this is very important because when you're thinking about adding that extra 3rd on top of your 5, when you're thinking about the actual function of it, in other words, if it's major or minor, how it relates in harmony to the chord, you're not going to be thinking so much about your 5th in relationship to your 7th. You're more so going to be thinking about your 1 in comparison to your 7th. So in comparison to my 1, this is a minor 7th. But in comparison to my 5, it's a major 3rd. So in other words, a half diminished 7 chord has a minor 3rd on the bottom, minor 3rd on top, and then a major 3rd on top of that. Or in other words, 3 semitones between 1 and 3, 3 semitones between 3 and 5, then 4 semitones in between 5 and 7. Okay, so that is really good to understand for this next one here, because this next one here we have that fully diminished 7. And to understand why it's called a fully diminished 7, what I just taught you will really help you understand this. Okay, so let's look at what's going on here. From that 1 to our 3, we have a minor 3rd. From that 3 to our 5, we have another minor 3rd. So of course we have that diminished. Then from our 5 to our 7, we have another minor 3rd. So in other words, from that 1 to the 3, 3 semitones. From that 3 to the 5, 3 semitones. From the 5 to the 7, another 3 semitones. And you could say, okay, 3, 3, 3, okay, it's fully diminished, that makes sense. But let's think about why in harmony it's actually fully diminished. And that's because if you look at your 1 to your 7, you have a diminished 7, which remember I was explaining is the same thing as a major 6th. So since we have a diminished 7 added on top of a diminished triad, it's fully diminished. Everything is diminished. The triad's diminished and the seventh is diminished. Diminished, diminished. Even though it's calling it a major sixth, it's enharmonic to a diminished. Okay, so now that I went over all the common types, let's kind of go over these least common types, and this will probably just help us kind of remember what's going on here, wrap our head around sevenths, and then maybe give us some ideas about some different chords that are maybe not so commonly used. Okay, so first we're going to start on this major line. We already did the major seventh, we already did the dominant seventh. Okay, so as I explained, I used those 5 most common types of 7 chords because those are the 7 chords that you get when you take a major scale. You use those notes in the key and you start to build 7th chords using all the notes in the key. So what that means is that these other chords that I'm about to show you would be chords that would be non-diatonic. In other words, not every note that's going to be in this chord is actually going to fit in the key you're using, but that'll be saved for another video. As well as I will have a video explaining creating triads in a major scale, and then I'll have one about creating sevenths in a major scale, and I'll walk you through it. And then you can understand why when we build these scales, we have the certain things like major and minor and diminished and whatnot. And we can understand, okay, so which chords in a key are going to be major, minor, and all that. And you can actually understand all that very simply. So those will be the sequels to this video. Okay, so now let's get into it. We're going to go over one to the right of this dominant seventh here, and we're looking at the territory of a major diminished, which as you can see with the dark blue, it's showing us that we have a major triad on the bottom. Then above that in orange, it's telling us that on top of that major triad, we have a diminished seventh. In other words, a major sixth. We go over to the right one more and we have a major augmented. So we have a major third, and then on top of that we have an augmented seventh. In other words, a perfect eighth or an octave. And again, in certain contexts, this could be considered as a major augmented seventh chord. Although here they're just calling it an F major chord because we have an F major chord with an octave on top of it. So essentially, there's just 2 F notes being played. And just to explain this so you don't have any confusion, you might say, wait, that's not a third, that is a fourth away. Well, technically, the note that you're looking at on the piano is technically a fourth away. But if we're thinking about this as an augmented seventh, we're not going to be thinking about this note as an F. We're actually going to be thinking about it as an E sharp. Our E is here, and if we go up 1 semitone from our E, we could call this note an E sharp, even though normally we call it an F, because technically it is 1 semitone above an E. So if you see someone saying E sharp ever, know that they're saying the note F, but they're speaking in enharmonic terms, calling it an E sharp. Okay, this next one is probably my favorite, because out of all these not so commonly used 7th chords, this one probably is the most common one, and that is a minor major 7th. This has a very interesting sound to it. Because your minor kind of has a very nice harmonious sound to it, and then when you add the major minor 7th, there's something kind of going on there, a little extra dissonance. Okay, so as you can see here, the minor major 7th chord is consisted of a minor triad on the bottom, and then you have a major 7th on top of that. In other notes, from your 1 to your 3, you have 3 semitones. From your 3 to your 5, you have 4 semitones. Then from your 5 to your 7, you have another 4 semitones. Okay, we go over one. We already went over what a minor 7th is. That's a minor triad with a minor 7th on top of it. Let's go over one more from there, and we have a minor diminished 7th. So you're probably getting the hang of this here, but it's, you know, just good to kind of go over this. And as I'm going over the semitones thing, it'd be good for you to kind of do this with me and try to guess it before I say it to kind of review all this. Little things like that will just kind of really imprint this in your brain for good. Okay, so we have that minor diminished. So let's think about that. So we have a minor triad on the bottom. Then we have a diminished 7th on top of that, which they're calling a major 6th here. And so technically this is a minor diminished chord, but they're calling it an A minor 6th because in all other words, it's a minor chord with a major 6th on top of it, which would commonly be known as just an A minor 6th. But in maybe some more complex harmony, you'd be thinking about this as a minor diminished chord. Okay, so with a minor diminished 7, it's kind of weird because if you count these semitones, since you have a diminished 7, it kind of creates a weird gap in the end. So in terms of semitones between the 1 and the 3, we have 3 semitones. Then between the 3 and the 5, we have 4 semitones. Then from that 5 to our 7, we only have 2 semitones. So a minor diminished 7th chord is the pattern of 3 semitones, 4 semitones, and then 2 semitones. Okay, next we go over to the right one more. We have minor augmented. And as you can see, you have a minor triad on the bottom, then you have an augmented 7th on top of that, which is commonly known as an octave. So your minor augmented is in reality just a minor chord, and then an octave from that first note on top of it. Okay, so now let's go to our next one. We're going to go in this diminished column. We're going to go to our first one. We have a diminished major. Okay, so you're probably just thinking, well, that's just a diminished triad with a major 7th on top of that. And well, yeah, you are correct. That is what a diminished major 7th is. But there's something kind of odd going in here between these semitones. Because if we look at a diminished triad, instead of, like I was saying, having those 7 semitones in total, we only have 6. So since we have a minor third, and then we have another minor third, we have 6 semitones in total here. So since we only have 6 semitones here in a diminished, and we normally have 7 semitones in a minor, and we'd normally have 7 semitones in a major, what this means is that between the 5 and the 7, it's not going to be a major third. It's actually going to be what would be called a perfect fourth, or you could think about it as an augmented third. And this is because when you have that diminished triad, you're actually 1 semitone shorter of what would be a major or a minor chord. And because of that, you don't have a 4 semitone difference between your 5 and your 7. You have that 5 semitone difference, which makes a perfect fourth. So when you're looking at 7th chords, you're not going to be looking at the 7 in relationship to your 5. Because if you do, you're probably going to be kind of confused. You say, okay, you add a perfect fourth on top of a diminished triad, and things start to get kind of confusing there. Until you realize that you just take your first note and you build a major 7th on top of that first note in relationship. And it's not about the relationship between the 5 and the 7. So that's why I was kind of teaching it the whole time as a triad with this 7th on top of it, instead of saying it's a triad with this third on top of it, because then we'll start getting into some confusing territory. If we think about it in the beginning as a triad with this 7th on top of it, then we will eliminate a lot of confusion down the road. Okay, next we already did a half diminished 7. We go over one, we already did a fully diminished 7. So now we have a diminished augmented. Okay, so now if you just thought about what we just did with the diminished major, you might think, okay, things are getting kind of weird here. So of course in nature, a diminished augmented is just telling us we have that diminished triad on the bottom, and then we have that augmented 7th on top of that. And you might think simple enough here, but let's really look at what's going on here. So again, we have that diminished triad. So we have a minor third and another minor third. So between the 1 and the 3, we have 3 semitones. Between the 3 and the 5, we have another 3 semitones. So that's why it's diminished. But then from there, we don't go up an augmented triad. So just to kind of show you what would happen if we went up an augmented triad, then we just have a B diminished major 7, which is what we already did. So again, it's not the relationship between that 5 and the 7. We got to look at the 1. So we want to build an augmented 7th from this 1. Well, an augmented 7th is 1 semitone above a major 7th. So we're just landing on that octave. So because of that, if you take your 5th and you start counting the semitones, you'll see something kind of interesting here. And that's you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 semitones away. So I don't know if anything's going off in your brain right now. So what's going on here is in your triad, you have 6 semitones. And then on top of that, from your F, you have another 6 semitones. So yeah, you could call this a diminished augmented 7th chord, but it's also kind of interesting because if you take this D away in this diminished chord, you have a tritone. Then if you go from F to B, you have another tritone. Something that's really interesting about tritones is since they have 6 semitones, they're the only inversion that when you invert them, or when you flip it upside down, you still get 6 semitones. So if you get a B to an F, you get a tritone. If you get an F to a B, you get a tritone. So it's very interesting that in a diminished augmented chord, in this case we're in B, we're going to start in B and we're going to create that diminished triad. And then we add that augmented 7th on top of it. But in context, if we actually do look at this whole thing, and in this case, just for looking at what's going on with the notes here, when we compare that 5 to the 7, we see it's the same thing as the 1 to the 5. So I'll take away that 3, and I'll just have B, F, B. Let's count the semitones from B. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lands us on F. From F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lands us on B. While in other cases, if you invert an interval, in this case I'll do C to E, and then I'll do E to C. And as you can see, the semitones obviously changed quite a lot from having a major third to having a minor sixth, and that's what happens when we invert a major third. So that was kind of a random lesson on tritones there, but there's a lot to learn about tritones, so I'll make a whole video about that one. Okay, so next we have the augmented major seventh, which I find very interesting because if you look at it, it's called a major 7 sharp 5. And if you remember, the half diminished was called a minor 7 flat 5. So in my opinion, it's almost like an opposite. You have a major 7 and then you have a sharp 5. So it makes it a very bright chord when you have that major 7th and you have that sharp 5. Versus when you have a minor chord and then you also have that flat 5, it kind of makes it sort of a darker chord. Okay, so augmented major. By now we know that means that we have an augmented chord and then we have a major 7th on top of that. Okay, next, this is also a really interesting one. We have an augmented minor. So of course we start with an augmented triad and then we put a minor 7th on top of that, and look what happens. So that gives us what they're calling here a C dominant 7 sharp 5, a very interesting chord. Since we augmented that major triad, when we go to that minor 7th, now there's only a 2 semitone gap in between our 5 and our 7. As you can see, that A flat, 1, 2, we have that B flat, augmented minor. Okay, so this next one hopefully scares you a little bit. It scares me a little bit. We have an augmented diminished 7 chord. And here they're calling that a minor major 7th over C chord. Wow. So I'm not going to get over to what the blank over blank chord means in this video. If you are curious, look up what slash chords mean. I'll have a video on that at some point. Okay, so since we augmented our triad, and since we diminished our 7th, when you put this all together, you see that between the 5 and the 7, there's a 1 semitone difference, creating a minor 2nd, which is a very dissonant tone. I wouldn't think about this as a dissonant harmonization. I would actually think about this as non-harmonizing. So I personally wouldn't think about this as consonant harmonization and dissonant harmonization. I would think about this as harmonizing and non-harmonizing. Next, we're going to go over to the right one, and we have an augmented 7th chord. Okay, so again, we have an augmented triad, and we have an augmented 7th, even though they're calling it an augmented triad here because I'm playing 2 C's. So look out for my next video. It's going to be how to actually create chords in a key. First, I'm going to do triads, then I'm going to do 7th. After that, I'm going to show you how to invert all these. So if we want to take these intervals and we want to create inversions, we can do inversions from triads, and we can do inversions from 7th chords. This can give us some more complex sounding music, and it can give us a lot more variation and options when we think about chord voicings and we want to do some common tones, or even if we want to do some counterpoint, whatever it is, inverting chords will give us a lot more options. So the last thing I'll say is that in this key you can see that I summarize the fact that if you have a major 7 all added together, you have 11 semitones in all, while your dominant 7th, minor 7th, and your half diminished 7th have 10 semitones. So each one of them have 10 semitones, just arranged in a different order. I find that really interesting. And then if you look at your fully diminished 7, you have only 9 semitones. So it makes sense because it's diminished compared to the minor. Chord inversions for 7th chords. If you have a triad, you can have a root position triad, you can have a first inversion triad, and you can also have a second inversion triad. But now things get a little different here when we're dealing with 7th chords because you have that extra note on the end. Okay, so since you have that extra note on the end, now you're able to make one more inversion. So in 7th chords, we have a root position 7th chord, we have a first inversion 7th chord, a second inversion 7th chord, and also a third inversion 7th chord. So you might have noticed things are already a little different here, and that will be explained in this video. Okay, so let's first do a quick refreshment on chords. So a triad, we have a 1, 3, and a 5. A 7th chord, we have that extra 7th on top, so we have that 1, 3, 5, and 7. Okay, and that is consisted of all thirds. So you start on this first note, you build a third to this next note, From this next note, you build a third to the next note. From that note, you build a third to the next note. And as you can see over here, I drew that. So between C and E, we have a third. Between E and G, we have a third. And between G and B, we have a third. This table up here is going to help you understand what is going on throughout this video. So as you can see here are intervals when stacked. So when I stack that chord, you can see that I have a 1, 3, 5, and 7 because it's all in relationship to this root note. So you have your 1 here. From your 1, you have a 3. From your 1, now you have a 5. And from your 1, now you have a 7. It's good just to understand this. Over here, as you can see, I have the notes in the chords. So our root position chord is C, E, G, B. You read it from the bottom up. As I just went over, it's all thirds. And then here is figured bass, which I'm going to go over more towards the end. And then here's a little table just to kind of walk you through what's going on. So in root position, we had our C, E, G, B, a 1, 3, 7, and 5, and you can see that we just skipped that note in the middle of each of those notes to create that. So this table is going to show you in caps the notes that are in the chord with numbers above it, and then in lowercase there's going to be no numbers above it, and those are going to be the notes that are in the middle of the chord that you're not playing. So those notes are not in the chord, but they're the notes that are in between the chord notes. Okay, before we actually get into the first, second, and third inversion, let's think about one important thing here. And that's that when you build a 1, 3, 5, and 7, when you build that 7, look at your next note. Your next note is a C. So here I'm building a C major 7. So I'm starting on the note C. My last note is B. But if you just go one note up from that B, now I have a C, which is the exact note that I'm starting on. Okay, so now let's get into first inversion. So if we have that root position 7th chord, 1, 3, 5, and 7, we're going to take that 1 and we're going to move it on top of the chord. Okay, so right now it's at the bottom of the chord. Now we're going to move it to the top of the chord, right there. So one more time, I take that 1, I took that first note, that C, I just remove it and I put it at the end of the chord or on top of the chord. So there's my first inversion, C major 7 chord. And if you remember inversions for triads, you can see that things are already a little different here because we have that B and that C at the end, which creates a second. Okay, so let's kind of analyze that. So instead of a 1, 3, 5, and 7, now because those last two notes are right next to each other, now I have a 1, 3, 5, and 6. Because as you can see, between my E and my G, there's a third. Between my G and my B, there's also another third. Then between my B and my C, there's only a second. Okay, so we have 1, 3, 5, 6, root, a third above that, a third above that, and then a second above that. Okay, now let's go back to the root position 7th chord. So now from here, if I want to build a second inversion 7th chord, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 1 and my 3, or in other words, my first two notes of the chord, and now I'm going to put both of those notes in the same order on top of the chord or at the end of the chord. On top of the chord or end of the chord is the same thing, just kind of a different way of looking at it. Okay, so I have C, E, G, B, and I'm taking C, E, and I'm going to put that on top of G and B. So now I have G, B, C, E. That is my second inversion C major 7 chord. And as you can see, now my second is in the middle. Okay, so let's analyze this. From G to B, I still have a third in the middle of that, but then just going from B to C, and I mean, you can count on your fingers, A, B, C. There's only two in between that, B and C. So there we have a second, and then from C to E, we have a third. So that means this chord, instead of being a 1, 3, 5, 7, is a 1, 3, 4, and 6. And remember, all those notes that are in the middle of the chord are down here, just to kind of help you understand this. Okay, so now back to the root position 7th chord. Now if I want to do a third inversion, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these first 3 notes, or in other words, my 1, 3, and my 5, and I'm going to put all those on top of my 7. So I have C, E, G, and then B, and I'm going to take that C, E, G, and I'm going to put that on top of my B. So now with third inversion, my second is there on the very bottom of it. So if we analyze this, between B and C, I have a second. Between C and E, I have a third. And between E and G, I have another third. So because it starts with that second right away, instead of having a 1, 3, 5, 7, you have a 1, 2, 4, 6. And you can see that there on the piano. It's a 1, 2, and then it goes up a third, and then it goes up another third. So as you can see, when you invert 7th chords, things are quite different, especially because you have that additional 7th note, and on top of that, that 7th note is only one note away from your root note on your original root position 7th chord. So now you're having to deal with all these second intervals in the chord instead of like intervals for triads where you're just dealing with fourths instead of thirds. So when you compare that, when you have fourths in your chord, that's going to be more consonant than if you have seconds in your chord. So with inversions for 7th chords, we start to deal with some more dissonant intervals here inside of the chord, which can allow us to create some interesting musical suspense and also give us some interesting options when doing chord voicings. Okay, so now just to kind of conclude everything before I move on to figured bass. So if we have a root position C major 7 chord, I'm going to start on C, I'm going to go up a third, go up another third, and go up another third. In other words, I have a 1, 3, 5, and 7. To do a first inversion 7th chord, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take that first note, that 1, and I'm going to put it on top of the rest of the chord. So now instead of having C, E, G, B, now I have E, G, B, C. And instead of having a 1, 3, 5, 7, now I have a 1, 3, 5, and 6. Then back to my root position 7th chord. Now if I want to build a second inversion from here, I'm going to take my first two notes, my 1 and my 3, and I'm going to put that on top of the chord. So now instead of C, E, G, B, now I have G, B, C, E. And instead of like in my root position having a 1, 3, 5, and 7, now I have a 1, 3, 4, and 6. Back to the root position 7th chord. Now if I want to build a third inversion 7th chord, I'm going to take these first 3 notes, or my 1, 3, and my 5, and I'm going to put all those on top of the chord. So now instead of having C, E, G, and B, I have B, C, E, and G. Okay, now just to quickly show you that visually in case that didn't click. So in root position, you have C, E, G, B. And if you want first inversion, all you're going to do is you're going to take this C note and you're going to put that on top of the chord. Then if you're in root position, you want a second inversion, all you're going to do is take your 1 and your 3, or your first 2 notes of the chord in the same order, and you're going to place those on top of the chord. And now if you want a third inversion 7th chord from this root position, all you do is you take the first 3 notes of the chord, or the 1, 3, and the 5 in the same order, and you put those on top of the chord. So all we're doing is we're taking the notes from the bottom and we're putting them on the top, and depending on what inversion we're doing tells us if we're going to be just taking 1 of those notes, 2 of those notes, or 3 of those notes. Okay, so now figured bass for 7th chords. I'm just going to show you how to notate it and to read for figured bass and how to make sense of it. So my chord inversions video, which was chord inversions for triads, I showed you the figured bass for the first and second inversion triads. And I also showed you that the root position triad is not labeled in figured bass. So if it's not labeled, you know it's a root position triad. So to kind of just refresh that, a first inversion triad would be labeled with a 6 below it, and a second inversion triad would be labeled with a 4 and a 6 below it. Okay, so now we already know that we can't notate a blank, a 6, or a 4-6 if we're doing anything with 7th chords, because those are already taken for the triads. So now we're going to have to come up with some different notations to describe 7th chord figured bass. And this all makes sense, and it has to do with the intervals in the chord, so let's get into it. First of all, a root position 7th chord will just be labeled as a 7 since you have that 1, 3, 5, and your 7. So the only difference between a root position triad, which is labeled with nothing, and the 7th chord is that you have that 7th added on top of it. And now a first inversion 7th chord is going to be labeled with a 5 and a 6. And this is all because instead of having a 1, 3, 5, and 7, now you have a 1, 3, 5, and 6. And you can't just call it a 6 because that is a first inversion triad. Because if you remembered, I said that also having a 6 below the note in figured bass for triads is another way of saying to not play the 5th. So when you put that 5, 6, you're reinforcing the fact that this is a 7th chord because you're playing the 5 and the 6. Okay, so first inversion is 5, 6. Okay, now second inversion is 3, 4. This makes sense because remember, in your second inversion, you have that second in the middle there. So you have a 1, 3, 4, and then 6. So instead of writing 3, 4, and 6, the 6 is already going to be assumed when we're writing a 3, 4. You're not going to have a triad that has a 3rd and a 4th in it. That's only going to occur in a 7th chord. So 3, 4 is describing the fact that this is a 7th chord and you have a 1, 3, 4, and 6. The 6 is assumed. Next we move on to third inversion, which is notated as 2 and 4. And this makes perfect sense because if you look at your third inversion, you have a 1, 2, 4, and 6. So again, your 6 is assumed because we know that there's no triad that will have a 2nd and 4th in it. That's only going to occur in a 3rd inversion 7th chord. So that 2-4 is just telling us to play that 3rd inversion. So we have a 1, 2, 4, and 6. The 6 again is assumed. Now let's just kind of talk about the position of C here. I did kind of talk about this in my triad video, but it'd probably be good to talk about this again. So as you can see, my root position, my C is my first note. And as you can see in my first inversion, my C is my last note. But in figured bass, it's still going to be written as a C 5-6 because that's telling me a first inversion C major 7 chord. And just to quickly describe why I know it's a C major 7, well, I know C, E, G, and B is a major 7. And as you can see on the staff here, there are no sharps or flats written anywhere here. So when this is telling you to build that 7th chord, it's telling you to build a 1, 3, 5, and 7. And if you do that, you have the notes C, E, G, and B, which I know is a C major 7th chord. And again, that's all because there's no sharp or flat here. Okay, so now my second inversion, you can see my C is my 3rd note. But again, that is the nature of a 2nd inversion 7th chord. And my 3rd inversion 7th chord, you can see my C is that 2nd note there. So what I'm explaining here is, let's look at the 3rd inversion here. It's not telling you to play a 1, 2, 4, and 6 from the note C. It's telling you to play a 3rd inversion of that C note because you have that 2 in your 4, which is communicating with you that that is a 3rd inversion. So we see the note C, but we know it's a 3rd inversion, which is a 1, 2, 4, and 6. So figured bass is almost like telling you where this note is going to be positioned in your chord. So figured bass is not really used in today's current day and age, but if you are studying music and want to know about music history, it is something important to know because in the Baroque and classical era, they did use figured bass a lot. So from like the 1600s to the middle of the 1700s, they were using figured bass a lot. And they would use figured bass a lot of times in the context of something called a basso continuo. So basically a basso continuo is going to have a line of music written, just one line, and it's going to have figured bass written below that. And the person playing and reading the music is going to be improvising, and they're going to be filling in the rest of the notes for the chords by looking at that figured bass. So it's good to understand this because maybe some original pieces of music you might be interested in studying might be written with figured bass. So then you could take that original piece and interpret it, try to make sense with it, compare how other people interpret it, see if you maybe agree with their interpretations. Building 7 chords in a major scale. So now we're going to take the notes that are in a major scale and we're going to build 7th chords from that. So this basically here, if you're in the key of C major, so what 7th chords are you going to be playing with C major to be in the key of C major? So it's really simple. So we get these 7 notes here, which make up C major, and we build a 7th. So starting from C, we're going to build a C, E, G, B chord, which uses all the notes in C major, and now we have a C major chord. If you want to understand 7th chords, major, minor, and all that, I have a video all about it. The link will be in this description. So basically we know this is a major 7th chord because C, E, and G makes a major triad, and then C to B makes a major 7th. So a major 7th with a major triad makes a major 7th chord. Okay, so before I get rid of all the notes here, I'm just going to kind of explain some stuff here. 7th chords can have some different qualities that differ from regular triads. These are now 7th chords. So now if we're just talking about the 7th chords that occur in a major scale, when you're just using notes that are in your scale, and you start to build chords off of it, you have a major 7th, you have a minor 7th, you have a dominant 7th, and you have a half diminished 7th. So as I went over, a major 7th means that you have a major triad on the bottom, and then you have that major 7th on the top. So this out here, the M7 is kind of showing you that from your C to your B, you have a major 7. In other words, your root to your 7th. Then we can have a minor 7th. So as here you can see that just means there's a minor triad on the bottom, minor 7th on top of that. Then the dominant 7th has that major triad with that minor 7th. And then a half diminished 7th has a diminished triad with a minor 7th. And up here are triads for comparison. Okay, since that first chord starting from C was that C major 7, as you can see, I labeled it I maj 7. Okay, so now from there, if we build a 7th chord from D, we have D, F, A, C, which is a minor seventh, so I have a lowercase ii7. Since the ii is already lowercase, it's already telling us it's a minor 7. Next, if we start on E, we have E, G, B, D, which is again a minor 7, so we have that I7. 4 literally just spells out face, F-A-C-E, and this is a major 7, so again we have that M-A-J-7. And that capital IV. But this next note, if we start on G, we have G, B, D, F. And this is a dominant 7th, so it's labeled as just a 5-7. So it's just telling you it's the 5th note of C major, it's the 5-7. So instead of it being major, since it's a capital 5-7, you'd think that it's probably major, but that actually means that it's a dominant 7. And a dominant 7 means that you have that major triad, and then you have a minor 7th on top of it. Next, moving on to A, C, E, G. So now I have a lowercase vi7. And remember, all that I'm doing is I'm getting the notes that are in the scale, and I'm just building a third from that bass note, and I'm doing that 3 times over. So let's look at it. So I just did A, so I went A, and I built a third, so remember it repeats. So I go back from A, B, I go back to C, I have A to C, go up another third E, another third G. It's that simple. Okay, now my last one, B, D, F, A. Now this is a half diminished 7 chord, so that's why it has a VII with a degree symbol looking thing with a slash through it. That's telling you that the degree symbol would be a diminished, but it has a slash through it, so it's telling you it's a half diminished. And it is a half diminished because you have a diminished triad on the bottom, B, D, and F, and then you have a minor 7th on top of that. Upper extensions, if you get a triad and you add a third above it, you get a 7th chord. And similar to that idea, if you start adding thirds above your 7th chord, now you get upper extensions. Okay, so to visualize that a lot better, I'm going to take this C major scale you're looking at right here, and I'm going to color code it, and then I'm going to write it out twice, and now I'm going to number them, and now I'm going to build thirds starting from C, so in other words, I'm just going to pick out every other note in the 2 scales that you're looking at. Okay, now I'm just going to number it, and since we're going up thirds, we're counting every other note, so we're going to have odd numbers. Okay, so as you can see, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. I'm going to stop at 13. I'm going to show you why in a second, but first of all, it's really good to understand what we're looking at here. Okay, so I labeled everything Roy G. Biv. In other words, it's the colors of the rainbow, which you might remember from school. So as you can see, I wrote that out here. It's your red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And now something interesting happens when we're adding these upper extensions. So since I labeled every note in the chord a different color of the Roy G. Biv, let's look at what happens when we add these upper extensions up to the 13th. Okay, so as you can see, I have a red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Okay, as you can see, that goes over every color that I labeled my C major scale as, since I just labeled the C major scale that Roy G. Biv. Okay, so before I move on and we start to understand the upper extensions a lot more, let's just kind of look at this a little further, because there's a few points to make here. And one of them is that when you build a triad or a 7th chord, you're just using the notes that are in the scale separated by thirds, so it can sound really nice together. And as you see up here, we have C, E, G, B, so it's nicely separated by those thirds. And what happens when we separate it by thirds is we're not using the notes D, F, and A. But now look what happens when I start adding the upper extensions. So now I get that D, F, and A. So in other words, the exact notes that we do not use when we're building a 7th chord are the exact notes that we use when we're building extensions on top of a 7th chord. And as you might know, if you take a note and you go up or down an octave, it's still going to function as the same note, just a higher or lower pitch of that same note. So for example, when I'm adding my 9, which is my D in this case, that is the same sound as this note, D. It's just a higher pitch version. So because of that, it's gonna function and sound similar to if I just added a D in there. So it's gonna sound similar if I take my 9, which is my D, and instead I do the D down here, which would be my 2. So as you can see, obviously not the same exact sound, but it is similar. And it's good to understand that when we're building these upper extensions up to 13, that we are including all of the notes that are in the scale. Okay, so it is logical to stop at 13 because when you add that 15th, all that you're doing is adding the same note that you started from. So I started on C, and now I'm ending on C 2 octaves up. Upper extensions can be called by their name, so 9, 11, and 13, and they can also be called what compound interval they are. I'm going to explain this. So I could call it a 2, 4, and a 6. So I could call it a compound major second, a compound perfect fourth, and a compound major sixth. An easy way to remember what upper extension interval you have is using the number 7. 7 minus your upper extension is the compound interval that you are working with. So if I add this 9th on top of my 7th, then I can do 9 minus 7, which is 2. So that tells me that my 9 is also a compound second. And specifically, it is a compound major second, and I'm going to go over why it's a compound major second. That part is actually pretty simple. And just to go over again why it's called a compound major second, that's because I have this note D, which is my 9th, but that is the same exact note as D, my second. It's just a higher up version. So because it's a higher up version, it's not a second, it's a compound second. So when an interval is compound, what it means is that it has a whole octave below it and then that interval. So just to look at that, I'm going from C to D. So as you can see, there's that whole octave difference between the D that's right next to the C and the D that I'm using as my 9 when I'm making that 9 chord. Okay, so your upper extension remains the same quality of interval. So if I'm doing a compound major second, let's first look at a major second. Okay, that's the note C and D. And now if I take my 7th chord and I add that D on top of it, I can think of this as a compound major second. It's still the note D, it's still a major second, but it is an octave higher than the note originally found in the scale, so therefore it is a compound major second. Okay, so now we know a compound major second is the same thing as a major ninth, but this also works for perfect intervals. So if I had a compound perfect fourth, that would be the same thing as a perfect 11th. Okay, so I'm going to break that down a little bit. So normally if we have a perfect fourth, we're going to have the notes C and F if we're starting from C. So now if I have this 7th chord and I want to add that compound perfect fourth on top of it, that could be thought of as a perfect 11th and can also be thought of as a compound perfect fourth. All of your upper extensions are diatonic, meaning that they're using the notes in the scale that you're using. So in this instance, we're using the C major scale. So all of my upper extensions in their regular form are going to use these notes in the scale. Furthermore, a major 9 chord does not mean that we're using a major 9. What it actually means is that we're using a major 7th with a diatonic 9th on top of it. Okay, so now if you're wondering, wait, a second ago I was just saying that this is a major 9th because it's using the same interval as the major 2nd. And yes, that is 100% correct. The only thing is that when we're looking at this C major 9 chord, all that I'm saying is that when it's saying C major 9, that means we have a C major 7 with a 9 on top of it. And since it's always diatonic with these upper extensions, it's a diatonic 9. But most of the time, people just think of them as the number. So like here we have a 9, then a sharp or flat symbol will tell them to play it up or down a semitone to achieve the desired sound the player wants. So we have that 9, we could do like a flat 9, we could also do a sharp 9. So it's really good just to understand this so we can understand what's going on in terms of pitch here and in terms of function of these pitches. If you're a little bit confused right now, it's going to get cleared up in a little bit, so just follow along. And things are going to start making some more sense. Okay, so since all intervals in a major scale compared to the root note are either major or perfect, we automatically know that the upper extensions in their default with no accidentals are always either major or perfect when you're comparing them to that root note. Okay, so I'm looking at this root note in the C major scale, so I'm looking at C, and I'm going to build all the intervals made of all the notes in the scale, and you're going to see something. And that is that I have a major second, a major third, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a major sixth, a major seventh, and a perfect octave. So as you can see, starting from that root note, everything is either major or perfect. So that means if I make a chord starting from C, so let's say I do a C major 7 chord, that means if I add my diatonic upper extensions, I know they're either going to be major or perfect. So in this case, I have a compound major 2nd, a compound perfect 4th, and a compound major 6th. So now I know we're only talking about odd numbers, but just to understand these upper extensions a little more, that is that when I'm looking at the context of C, 9 and 10 are both going to be compound major intervals, because 9 and 10 is the same thing. Remember, if you do that -7 as a second and a third. And since both of these are major, when they turn into their compound interval, they remain major. Then 11 and 12 are perfect compound intervals because it's using the same notes as the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth, just a higher pitch version. Then my 13th and my 14th are going to be major because they're just using the same notes as my major 6th and my major 7th. Now if I have my 15, that is perfect because my 15 is a compound perfect octave. So it's using the same note as if I just had an octave, but 1 octave higher than that. Okay, now everything I just showed you about the major and perfect intervals in comparison to that C note only work when you're looking at this note C. When you look at D, all of a sudden you run into something. Okay, we have a major 2nd, and then we have a minor 3rd, and as we go so on, we then get another minor interval. If we go up to E, you start to see that then we actually start to get a lot of minor intervals, so the functions start to kind of change there, but it's good to comprehend this. So every note in the scale is going to give us a different result, and because of this, it is better just to call the extension by its number, 9, 11, or 13. So learning that information about the major and the perfect intervals in comparison to that root note, that's just helping us understand upper extensions more, because now we can comprehend the fact that when we are going to different notes in the scale, that's not always the case. So we're going to have some different functions because of that. Popular sheet music sometimes shows chord symbols using the numbers 2, 4, and 6 to label the same extensions that you would as 9, 11, or 13. This is because this is generally considered easier for the musician to read. It is good to know that both 9, 11, and 13 and 2, 4, and 6 can refer to the same extensions. It is more common that upper extensions are referred to by their numbers that exceed the number 8 or the octave, so 9, 11, and 13. In other words, the numbers that are greater than the numbers which identify the chord tones. So you have your 1, 3, 5, and 7, and when you go above that, you're still going up your odd numbers, so you get your 9, 11, and 13. So you have your 1, 3, 5, and 7, and since you're going up odd numbers, then you have your 9, 11, and 13. And that makes a lot of sense because you're just continually going up those odd numbers, those thirds. So that is the more common way to notate it. So typically when you're dealing with upper extensions, your lower 4 notes that can be found in the chord, your 1, 3, 5, and 7, are thought to be your chordal tones. While the upper 3 notes, the 9, 11, and 13, are known as upper extensions or can just be thought of as extensions. Jazz players often use upper extensions for adding more color to their music. Sometimes upper extensions are just added on top of single chords for more color. So you might add a 9 on top of your 7th chord to make it sound a little more full. And sometimes upper extensions are used to make more colorful chord progressions and resolutions, as well as more colorful harmonies. Okay, so that's basically it for this video. Upper extensions. The only other thing that I want to talk about is this little extra note that I have in this bold square here. And I saved this for the last because I kind of think of this more like an extra note. It doesn't exactly fit exactly like all the other notes in this video do. It can be thought of as slightly off topic, but it does correlate with a lot of the things that I added in this video, and it's just something good to keep in mind. So remember I was saying that it makes sense to stop at 15 since 15 is your compound octave, which in other words is just using that same note as your starting note, ending up in the same place that you started. But what happens if I want to go from that 15 and I want to build above that? So I want a 17, I want a 19th, I want a 21st, okay? So there's no one telling you that you can't do that. There's just something to consider that, especially for someone trying to read that and play that, that is not a very generic way to notate that. So if someone was reading that and they wanted to play it, they probably would be confused and not trained on how to do that, because that is not something you typically see. So there are more conventional approaches to this. This is known as the quindecesima, notated as 15 MA. This means that you play the note or the notes that are notated 2 octaves higher than what you're seeing written. There's also a quindecesima bassa, which is notated as 15 MB. This means that you play the note or the notes 2 octaves lower than what you see as written. Okay, so let's say written down you saw the note C, and then after that you saw the note E, just like this, but instead there is a quindecesima written next to it. So that would be communicating with you or the player that you're not going to be playing the next E 1 octave up, you're going to be playing 2 octaves up. So the next E. And as you can imagine, that'll be a lot easier for the player to read, saying, okay, I'm just going to play the note E 2 octaves up on my instrument. Okay, now this just leads to the topic of an ottava line, notated as 8 VA. This means you play the note or notes 1 octave higher than what is written. There's also an ottava bassa, notated as 8 VB. This means you play the note or notes 1 octave lower than what is written. This is an entirely different topic than upper extensions of chords or chord extensions, but it's something that is good to know. The tritone, also known as the augmented fourth as well as the diminished fifth. The tritone is an interval made up of 3 tones or 6 semitones. And that's why it is called a tritone. A semitone is 1 step in the chromatic scale, and a tone is 2 steps in the chromatic scale. It is the interval of half an octave. Because of this, it is the only interval that remains the same when you invert it. So the example I've been showing is C to F sharp, so that creates a tritone. So now if we invert it, we get F sharp to C, which is still a tritone. This makes sense because the chromatic scale is 12 semitones and the tritone has 6 semitones. So to further make sense of this, if you look at the chromatic scale here, you always start the first note that you're starting on as 0, and then you count the next possible note after that as your 1. And because of this, if we think 0 plus 6, we end up on F sharp, and this makes sense. And then if we do 6 plus 6, we end up on C. And because of that, if you keep going from C to F sharp to C to F sharp to C to F sharp to C to F sharp, you have tritones the entire time, and you keep just going up those tritones because you're just going up those 6 intervals, and in the chromatic scale you only have the 12 notes. Tritones resolve nicely when you go either 2 semitones out or 2 semitones in. So from C to F sharp, if you go 2 semitones out, you get B and G. So it'd sound like this. Then if you go 2 semitones in from that C to F sharp, now you have C sharp and F, and that would sound like this. Interestingly, the resolutions are a tritone apart from each other. So that G and that B is a tritone away from that C sharp to that E sharp. I called this note F and E sharp to make C sharp to E sharp that major third, instead of if I went C sharp to F, that would be a diminished fourth. Okay, tritones part 2. The tritone is very important in functional harmony. The diatonic dominant chord is used to establish the key when it resolves to the tonic. The dominant chord in triad form already contains that leading tone, which makes it want to resolve to the tonic. So since we're in the key of C, the last note in the scale is B, and since B and C are that half step apart, as well as B being the last note in the scale, this is that leading tone of the major scale. And interestingly, when you use a note as a third, so in this case we're actually building a chord, and the third is that B actually functions very strongly in this chord, and it's wanting to resolve to that C chord. So it's kind of interesting and important to understand that when a note is in the third of a chord, the note still has a lot of function in the chord. When a seventh is added, now the triad becomes a dominant seventh chord, which contains a tritone built from the third and the seventh of the chord. Additionally, a diminished chord is built on the 3, 5, and the 7 of the dominant seventh chord, And the diminished chord is always a tritone if you don't play that third. So a diminished chord has that tritone in it, and then it has that third right in the middle of it, because from that first note you go up 3 semitones, and then from that next note you go up another 3 semitones. And last, the diminished 7th chord has 2 tritones in it, making it a harmonically deceptive chord. The 2 tritones come from the 1 and the 5, and then also that 3 and the 7.